Ever feel like you're just buried under information, knowing you need to get smart on something important and fast?
Yeah, that feeling.
We know it. And that's really what this deep dive is for. We take the sources you give us, cut through all the noise, and pull out the stuff that matters. You know, the key insights, the surprising bits.
Helping you get informed quickly. Think of us as, well, guides. We look at the material you shared, figure out what's important, and connect the dots, getting to the so what for you.
Right. And today, we're digging into some pretty foundational ideas. The source material comes from excerpts of Milton and Rose Friedman's book from 1979, Free to Choose.
Which was based on that famous TV series, right?
Exactly. And it takes a really systematic look at, well, big questions. Economic systems, individual freedom, government's role. Our mission here is to pull the key nuggets from these specific excerpts just for you.
So we'll cover their main arguments, about markets, freedom, their take on why government got so big.
Yeah, and the examples they use? Inflation.
And where they thought things were heading back then in 79.
And honestly, there are some points in here that might surprise you. Like, the argument that government failure caused the Great Depression, not market failure.
Or that regulations designed to protect you could actually end up harming you. Yeah.
Or even how your own actions, according to the source, might play into some of these problems. Okay, so let's unpack this.
So where do they start? The Friedmans, I mean.
Well, they kind of lay this foundation, right? Seeing both economics and politics as, well, as markets.
Yeah, markets where people are basically pursuing their own interests, which, brings us right back to Adam Smith, the whole invisible hand idea.
Right, that people chasing their own goals often end up doing good for society even if they didn't intend to. Smith wasn't too keen on people claiming they were acting for the public good, was he?
Not really, no. He was pretty skeptical.
Okay, self-interest in buying and selling, that makes sense. But applying it to politics, too. How does the source connect that economic idea to political freedom?
That's a really critical link they make. They argue that economic freedom, well, it's not just nice to have, it's absolutely essential for political freedom, I mean.
Essential? Why?
Because, well, think about it. If you have economic freedom, you can cooperate with others voluntarily. You don't need permission from some central authority, right? It happens without coercion.
Okay.
And that inherently limits the power of the political sphere.
So dispersing economic power puts a check on political power. Is that the idea?
That's exactly it. The source is really clear on this. They say putting economic and political power together in the same hands. That's a sure recipe for tyranny. And historically, they argue you just don't see prosperity and freedom existing together unless voluntary exchange is like the main way society works.
So it's necessary, but maybe not sufficient on its own.
Pretty much. They see it as a necessary condition. A command economy, they argue, just can't sustain freedom. It relies too much on sort of underground markets anyway, and it lacks that decentralized power needed to challenge tyranny.
Okay, so voluntary exchange is key. How does this market system actually work so well, according to them? They talk a lot about the price system.
They do. They really highlight the price system. It's this incredibly efficient mechanism, but it's often unnoticed. Like the background noise of a healthy economy, you only notice when it breaks down.
And they use that stark example of the gas lines in the U.S. in the 70s.
Exactly. 1974, 1979. They point out, Germany, Japan, they were totally dependent on imported oil too, but they didn't have those lines.
So why the U.S.?
According to the source, government price controls. Simple as that. Preventing prices from rising naturally to reflect the scarcity. So instead of prices deciding who gets the gas, you had government rules. Command and control.
Leading to shortages and queues.
Yeah, shortages here, weird surpluses there, just inefficiency. When the price system works, it signals where stuff is needed, and usually you can buy what you want when you want it.
It sounds like prices do a lot more than just tell you the cost.
Oh, absolutely. The source really emphasizes how prices transmit information super efficiently. Like, say there's upheaval in a copper-producing country.
Okay.
The price of copper, it jumps almost instantly worldwide. And that information goes right to the people who need it, companies using copper without flooding everyone else.
Right. Unlike trying to manage that centrally, could central planning ever replicate that kind of information flow?
The source argues basically no, it just couldn't keep up. And beyond information, prices give incentives.
Incentives? How so?
Well, a higher price signals demand or scarcity, right?
Yeah.
So producers have an incentive to make more, even if it costs a bit more. And at the same time, users have an incentive to use it more efficiently or find cheaper alternatives.
This whole picture voluntary exchange price system, it sounds very Adam Smith, limited government kind of view. What did Smith see as government's core jobs, according to the source?
They outline Smith's three main duties. First, protect society from invasion, basic defense. Second, protect citizens from injustice or coercion by others. You know, enforcing contracts, rule of law, being the umpire.
Right.
And third, providing certain public works or institutions, things that benefit everyone but wouldn't be profitable for private businesses to do alone, like maybe basic infrastructure or promoting education.
That third one always sounds a bit, well, open-ended. Do they add any caveats?
They add a huge caveat. They say, look, government actions, just like market actions, have unintended consequences, third-party effects.
Okay.
And figuring out those external costs and benefits, it's hard, which means you can get government failure just as easily as market failure. Intervention isn't free of potential downsides.
Okay, so that's the foundational idea. Markets, freedom, limited government. But the source argues we moved away from that. What drove the shift?
It's kind of ironic, according to them. The very success of limited government made people forget its dangers. Things were stable, prosperous, so government didn't seem threatening.
So people started thinking about what more government could do.
Exactly. The appeal grew. People thought, well, if the right people were in charge, a stronger government could do so much good, forgetting the risks of concentrated power.
And the Great Depression was a key moment here.
Absolutely pivotal, in their view. And this is one of those surprising arguments. They say the Depression wasn't a failure of free markets. It was a failure of government, specifically in managing the money supply.
Wow. But it wasn't seen that way at the time.
No. The source says it was widely interpreted as a market failure. And that interpretation fundamentally changed what people expected government to do.
So it shifted the view from government as like an umpire just enforcing rules.
To government as more like a parent, actively intervening, coercing some people to help others. That's the shift they describe.
And the numbers back that up.
Dramatically.
Yeah.
They show government spending, which was maybe 12% of national income before 1929, shot up.
Yeah.
By the late 70s, it was over 40%.
Right.
Federal non-defense spending multiplied about 10 times relative to the economy in 50 years. Huge change.
And this leads to another core idea they present, sort of the flip side of Adam Smith's invisible hand.
Yeah, it's a really interesting counterpoint. They argue that in government, there's often an invisible hand working in the opposite direction.
Opposite.
Meaning people go into government or push for interventions genuinely wanting to serve the public good.
Oh.
But the system, the incentives, lead them to promote private interests instead. Maybe their own agency's interest or special interest. It's a theme throughout the source.
Okay, so the source then looks at specific areas where government grew and the results. Let's start with the welfare state.
Right. They document this massive expansion, especially from the 60s on. War on poverty, Social Security growth, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps. It just ballooned.
Any striking figures?
Oh, yeah. They mentioned the budget for HCW health, education, and welfare went from maybe $2 billion in the early 50s to $160 billion by 1978.
$160 billion.
Which was, get this, 1.5 times the entire U.S. defense budget then. And if HEW were a country, its budget would have been the third largest in the world, only behind the total U.S. and Soviet budgets. 1 out of every 100 employed people in the U.S. worked for HEW.
Wow. And what did the source see as the results of all this spending, despite the good intentions?
Generally disappointing is their conclusion. Lots of dissatisfaction, even among recipients. Social Security heading for financial trouble. Talk of a welfare mess, fraud, dependency.
They're particularly critical of how Social Security is often described, right?
Very. They call the typical description misleading. They use this analogy. Basically, it's like a chain letter.
The chain letter.
Yeah. The taxes current workers pay, they go straight out to pay current retirees. There's no real trust fund in the sense of your contributions being saved for you. The only guarantee you'll get benefits is if future taxpayers are willing and able to pay.
What about housing programs, urban renewal? Any better?
Not in their analysis, no. They argue these programs often ended up reducing the housing stock for the poor, not increasing it, tearing down old neighborhoods, replacing them with fewer, often poorly built units.
Why would that happen?
They suggest the driving force wasn't always pure altruism. It was often interests like contractors, banks, unions who benefited from the big projects. And they also blame rent control policies for worsening the decay of low-cost housing.
And medical care. Medicare and Medicaid came in and spending shot up.
Exploded after 1965, yeah. They used the British National Health Service, the NHS, as a kind of case study. Decades in, they noted fewer hospital beds per person, huge growth in admin staff compared to medical staff, long waiting lists.
And they have a theory for that.
They call it bureaucratic displacement theory. Basically, useless, inefficient work tends to drive out useful work in large bureaucracies.
This seems to connect to that simple framework they have about spending money. The 4 ways.
Exactly. That's a really key framework for understanding their critique. Let's break it down quickly. Category 1. Spending your own money on yourself. Like buying groceries. You watch the cost. You want value. Most efficient.
Makes sense.
Category 2. Spending your own money on someone else. A gift, say. You still watch the cost, but maybe you're less fussy about the exact item as long as they like it. Philanthropy fits here too.
Right.
Category 3. Spending someone else's money on yourself.
Right.
Expense accounts. Maybe using government funds improperly. You care a lot about getting what you want, much less about the cost.
Prone to abuse.
And then category 3. Spending someone else's money on someone else.
And that's the welfare state model.
That's what they argue. A bureaucrat spending taxpayer money on a beneficiary. And this, they say, is why it's almost inherently wasteful and often fails. Neither the spender nor the recipient has the same strong incentive for efficiency or value as when spending their own money.
So it leads to waste, failed goals, maybe corruption.
Yeah, and dependency, they argue. It weakens the social fabric by concentrating power and making people reliant on these programs decided by others.
So, given these criticisms, what's their alternative for helping people in need?
They strongly advocate for a negative income tax.
A negative income tax. How does that work?
The basic idea is pretty simple. You use the existing tax system. Everyone gets a certain amount of personal allowances or exemptions. If your income is below that level, instead of paying tax, the government sends you a percentage of the difference.
So it replaces the complex web of programs with just one payment.
That's the goal. Much simpler, integrated into the tax system, provides a basic income floor, transparent. But they do acknowledge the political problem.
Which is?
It's hard to transition. People already getting benefits from existing programs might end up getting less under the new system, even if it's better overall. Reducing benefits is always politically tough, though they do say, political feasibility is hard to predict.
Okay, let's shift from welfare to regulation. The source also critiques the growth there, right? Protecting the consumer.
Yes, another major area of government expansion they examine. Agencies like the ICC, the CPSC, the EPA.
The ICC, that's the Interstate Commerce Commission. Old one.
Right. And they argue its creation, regulating railroads, wasn't really about protecting consumers. It was pushed by the railroads themselves.
Really? Why?
To limit competition, to basically set up a government-backed cartel, fix prices, control routes. And they say that same pattern regulation benefiting the regulated industry, not the consumer, repeated with trucking and airlines.
They had that example about the trucking routes.
Yeah, Dayton Air Freight paying huge sums, like $100,000 a year, just for the right to use certain routes, paid to someone who didn't even own a truck, just because they held a government permit. Shows how regulation creates artificial value.
But they did see some positive signs with deregulation later on.
Absolutely. They point to the beginnings of airline deregulation, influenced by people like Freddie Laker and Alfred Kahn, as a huge success. Lower fares, better service, surprisingly, even higher airline earnings once competition kicked in. They saw it as proof the concept worked.
What about Food and Drugs, the FDA?
They critique the FDA, especially after a big change in 1962 following the thalidomide tragedy.
What changed?
The law started requiring drug companies to prove not just safety, but also efficacy, that the drug actually worked before it could be sold.
Sounds reasonable on the surface.
It does, but the source argues it had a major negative impact, delaying life-saving drugs. Drugs that were already approved and helping people in other countries were held up for years in the U.S. because of the lengthy efficacy trials.
Like what kind of drugs?
They mentioned things like beta blockers for heart conditions, some hypertension drugs, beneficial treatments that Americans couldn't get. They cite a study suggesting the harm from these delays, the drug lag, actually outweighed the benefits of keeping potentially bad drugs off the market. Market penalties and liability were already strong incentives for safety, they argued.
Now, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, the CPSC, the source gives some examples that are, well, pretty damning.
They really are quite startling. One was about aerosol spray adhesives, banned based on preliminary findings, which turned out to be wrong. But in the meantime, tragically, some women had abortions fearing harm to their unborn children. Then the ban was lifted.
Oh, wow. And the TRIFE example.
That one is just...
Yeah.
It's jaw-dropping.
Mm.
So the CPSC required manufacturers to use this chemical, trisize, as a flame retardant in kids' pajamas.
Required it.
Yes, mandated its use. Then later, trice was found to be a potent carcinogen, millions of kids exposed. And a kicker, the source says the CPSC then took credit for banning the chemical it had previously forced companies to use, without acknowledging their role in creating the problem.
That's incredible.
Their annual report apparently framed it as them fixing a dangerous situation they themselves created.
Okay, what about environmental protection? That seems like a clearer case for government, with pollution affecting third parties.
They agree it's a legitimate area for government involvement, based on their framework of third-party effects, definitely. But, they stress, government solutions have their own costs and negative side effects.
Like what?
Well, the costs are ultimately paid by consumers through higher prices. And they bring up this idea, related to director's law, that sometimes the benefits of environmental rules might go more to, say, wealthier people who value pristine environments, while the costs hit everyone, including the poor, disproportionately. They also make the point that, historically, air and water got cleaner because of industrial progress, providing the wealth and technology to deal with pollution, not in spite of it.
And the Department of Energy created after the '73 oil crisis? What's their take?
Highly critical.
Yeah.
They argue the obvious solution to the crisis, just remove the price controls on oil and gas, let the market work, wasn't taken.
Why not?
2 reasons, they suggest. 1, widespread misunderstanding of how prices actually work. 2, well, doing the simple thing would show the giant new bureaucracy, the DOE, was basically useless or even counterproductive. They argue government policies like price controls often actively block market solutions.
So if not all this regulation, how does the market protect consumers, in their view?
They point to middlemen, retailers, department stores. Think about it. Your relationship is usually with the store you bought from, right?
Yeah, usually.
Those stores have a huge incentive to monitor quality because their reputation is on the line. They act as the consumer's agent, vetting suppliers and ensuring quality in a way an individual consumer can't easily do.
And they bring up prohibition again here.
Yes, as another example of government trying to legislate morality or protect us from ourselves. It didn't stop drinking, it just drove it underground, created crime, made criminals out of ordinary people, all sorts of negative consequences.
Okay, let's turn to protecting workers. The source starts with a broad historical claim.
Yeah, they stayed up front that over the last couple of centuries, conditions for working people in the West improved dramatically. Wages, hours, safety, opportunities, huge progress.
And their explanation isn't unions or government.
No. They argue forcefully that the main driver was rising productivity, thanks to free markets, capital investment, innovation. Unions and government intervention, they say, were pretty minimal for most of that period of greatest progress.
They make a distinction between labor and labor unions.
Right. They point out, hey, most workers aren't in unions. And the interests of union leaders or even some members might not align with the interests of all workers or even the broader union membership.
So where does union power come from, according to the source?
Primarily, they argue, from restricting the supply of labor in some way, either keeping people out of jobs or sometimes working with employers to cartelize an industry.
How do they restrict supply?
Sometimes through, well, intimidation or violence, historically. But more often today, through getting government help, lobbying for laws that favor unions, limit competition, require union membership, etc.
They meant airline pilots as an example.
Yeah, calling them practically a ward of the state because of how regulations and union power protected their high salaries and limited entry. They also note unions are often exempt from antitrust laws that apply to businesses, letting them act like cartels. The Teamsters are mentioned.
What about unions in the public sector, government workers?
They argue those unions are often even stronger. Why? Because the government is spending someone else's money. That category is that spending again. Less resistance to demands when taxpayers foot the bill. Strongest where government is big and centralized.
Now, minimum wage laws. The source has a really strong, maybe controversial take on this.
They really do. They call minimum wage laws one of the most, if not the most, anti-black laws on the books.
Why such strong language?
Their argument is this. Minimum wage makes it illegal for employers to hire workers whose skills aren't yet worth that minimum amount. This disproportionately hurts young people, especially minority youth, who may have received poor schooling and need entry-level jobs to gain skills and experience.
So it prices them out of the market, prevents them from getting a foot on the ladder.
Exactly. They can't offer to work for less while they learn. The source cites statistics showing high teenage unemployment, particularly for black teens, which they argue is made worse by minimum wage laws.
What about professional licensure? Doctors, lawyers?
They see licensure needing a government license to practice a profession as another way to restrict entry and limit competition. Often the licensing boards are run by people already in the profession.
So they control who gets in.
Effectively, yes. They mention an FTC chair listing all sorts of occupations needing licenses, some sounding quite odd. They use the American Medical Association, the AMA, as a prime example of a powerful group that, they argue, used licensure to restrict the number of doctors, drive up cost, and limit competition, even if the stated motive was quality control.
They mention paramedics, too.
As an example of a useful service that can be hindered by overly strict licensure rules controlled by existing professions, yeah.
So if it's not unions or government rules, what really protects workers, according to the source?
Simple. Competition among employers. Lots of different employers needing workers. That competition forces them to pay people what they're worth. If one employer doesn't, the worker can go somewhere else.
So competition is the best protection.
They argue it's the best, or at least bad, protection for the vast majority of workers.
And this competition throughout the system for workers, capital, customers, that's how the fruits of progress get spread around.
That's the core argument, yes.
Yeah.
How the benefits of rising productivity reach everyone.
Okay, let's switch gears completely. Inflation. A huge issue back in '79. How does the source define money?
Basically, as a social convention, something we all agree to accept in exchange. Its value comes from that mutual acceptance, and it's absolutely vital for a complex economy. Without it, exchange grinds to a halt.
And who controls the amount of money?
This is central to their argument. In modern economies, the government alone determines the quantity of money.
So if there's rapid inflation,
It's the government's responsibility. That leads directly to their famous line. Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, caused by too much money chasing too few goods.
why would a government do that? Create too much money?
The main reason they give, it's a way to finance government spending without explicitly raising taxes. They call it the inflation tax.
Inflation tax.
Yeah, it's hidden. By creating more money, the government gets to spend it first, before prices fully adjust. This effectively transfers purchasing power from people holding money to the government, like building a road by just printing the money. The value of everyone else's money goes down a bit.
And they quote Keynes on how dangerous this is.
Yes, saying there's no subtler, no surer means of overturning the existing basis of society than to debauch the currency. And that most people don't even understand how it's happening. They point to hyperinflations, Germany, Hungary, China, as extreme examples of the destruction it can cause.
What about the idea that you need a little inflation to fight unemployment? The trade-off.
They argue that's a false dichotomy. Slow growth and unemployment aren't cures for inflation. They are painful side effects that often happen when you stop inflating, when you take the necessary steps to cure it by slowing money growth.
Like feeling sick when you recover from surgery?
Exactly. The cure itself can have temporary negative effects, but those effects aren't the cure.
So what is the cure for inflation, according to them?
Simple. Slow down the rate of growth of the money supply. They mentioned Japan having done this successfully.
What about indexing? Linking wages and contracts to inflation?
They see it as potentially useful, but mainly temporarily, to ease the pain and distortions while inflation is being brought down. But permanent, widespread indexing, they worry it could make money less efficient as a medium of exchange.
But they do support permanent indexing for some government things.
Yes, strongly, for government spending, taxes, and borrowing. Indexing income taxes is crucial, they say, to stop taxation without representation, where inflation pushes you into higher brackets without your real income changing.
And it reduces the government's incentive to inflate.
Exactly. If tax brackets are indexed, inflation doesn't automatically generate more real revenue. Indexing government bonds is just honesty, they argue. So the government doesn't profit from the inflation it causes by paying back bondholders with cheaper money.
And they connect this monetary view back to the Great Depression again, specifically the Fed's role.
Oh, absolutely. A scathing critique. They argue the Fed failed miserably. It stood by while banks collapsed in waves, its actions were too little, too late, and it was hampered by internal power struggles.
So the Fed could have done something.
Yes, the source argues they had the power, especially through large-scale open market purchases, buying government bonds to inject cash into the system. But they didn't use it effectively. They conclude the Fed promotes this myth that the private economy is inherently unstable when the Fed's own history especially during the Depression, shows government has often been the primary source of instability.
Okay, so wrapping up, the source looks at the situation in 1979. They saw a reaction setting in against big government.
They did. They felt there was a real tide turning across the West. They mentioned Thatcher in the UK, stirrings in Sweden and France, the tax revolt movement in the US, like Proposition 13 in California.
What was driving it?
Basically, dissatisfaction with the results, high inflation, high taxes, inefficiency, red tape, overregulation. People were feeling the negative consequences directly.
And they saw people trying to find ways around government.
Yeah, examples like a private postal service starting up in Rochester, New York to compete with a monopoly, or barter systems and tax avoidance cropping up in high-tax places like Sweden. People finding ways to cope.
And they argue that as government grows, something fundamental changes in the relationship between people and the state.
It weakens, becomes more distant. The bureaucracy itself becomes a powerful special interest, a new class. They point to Washington, D.C. becoming a magnet for lawyers and lobbyists, the revolving door phenomenon.
Where success depends more on connections than on, say, creating value.
That's their argument. Knowing the right people, influencing regulations becomes key. The idea of government acting purely in the general interest starts to look pretty thin as various groups openly lobby for their piece of the pie.
And this impacts the ideal of a government of laws, not of men.
They argue it makes a mockery of it. Bureaucrats gain huge discretionary power. Instead of being servants of the law, they become masters, telling citizens what they can and cannot do.
So to turn this around, what solutions did they propose back then?
A big one was a constitutional amendment to limit government spending, tying it to a fixed or gradually decreasing percentage of national income.
Why an amendment?
The thinking was, it forces everyone to compete for a slice of a limited pie. Special interests can't just collude to make the whole pie bigger at the taxpayer's expense. They'd have to argue why their program deserves funding more than someone else's.
What else?
Lowering trade barriers, getting rid of price controls and wage controls, eliminating occupational licensure, basically rolling back interventions.
And ensuring sound money.
Yes, maybe another constitutional amendment for stable money, or perhaps extending the Fifth Amendment's protection against taking private property to explicitly cover the inflation tax or regulatory actions that destroy value.
They end with a pretty striking comparison, don't they?
They do. They list points from the 1848 Communist Manifesto and compare them to U.S. government policies that were actually in place by 1979. Things like progressive income tax, government control of credit, state control of communication and transport. It's designed to shock, to show how far things had shifted towards collectivism in their view.
And their overall conclusion in 1979, were they optimistic? Pessimistic?
Cautiously optimistic, I'd say. They felt the tide was turning because the negative results of big government were becoming undeniable. Inflation, inefficiency. People were fed up. They saw it as a crucial moment, an opportunity to push public opinion back towards relying more on individual freedom and voluntary cooperation.
So quite a journey through the core ideas in these excerpts from Free to Choose. We've hit their framework on markets and freedom, their critique of government growth, with examples from welfare, regulation, labor.
Yeah, their analysis of inflation, the proposals for change, and that sense they had in 1979 that things might be shifting.
And what's really striking, as you said, is how many of these debates are still front and center today, isn't it?
Absolutely. The arguments about the right balance between government and individual freedom, the consequences of regulation, the nature of inflation, they haven't gone away.
Not at all. And remember, we did this deep dive specifically for you. To boil down these complex ideas, pull out the key insights from the source material, and help you get informed quickly.
So maybe a final thought to leave you with. Building on their 1979 perspective, the Friedman saw a tide potentially turning against big government back then, driven by dissatisfaction. Now, over 4 decades later, looking at the world around us.
What does the current size and scope of government and maybe public attitudes towards it tell us about that trend that they thought they saw? This raises an important question. What does all this mean for you today?